It was New Year's Eve in Atlanta, Georgia. Cool air curling over the city like a soft winter shawl. Fireworks were already crackling in the distance and families gathered to celebrate. But 25-year-old Elias Monroe lay in bed wrapped not in celebration, but in a deepening fog of exhaustion. For days he'd battled fatigue, night sweats, and an unrelenting fever. He told himself it was probably the flu. After all, he had pushed himself hard at work lately, staying late at the counseling center, where he helped troubled teens get back on their feet. The year had taken a toll, and maybe this was just his body telling him to rest. But this felt different. Elias was no stranger to being strong. Raised by a single mother in a modest neighborhood just south of downtown, he had grown up with the quiet conviction that life didn't owe him ease. It offered him purpose. He had been the kid who sang in the church choir with a voice older than his years, and the teenager who chose tutoring over trouble. That same sense of purpose led him to college and then to Atlanta, where he worked as a counselor for young black men living with HIV. But Elias carried dreams beyond his job. Deep down, he still longed to sing, to write music, to share stories through melody. Yet he had shelved that dream, telling himself there were more practical things to do. By the afternoon of December 31st, the symptoms had worsened. His limbs felt heavy. His breathing became shallow. His reflection in the bathroom mirror looked like a stranger, pale, gaunt, eyes sunken. A quiet alarm stirred in his gut. Reluctantly, he called his mother back home in Savannah. "Mama," he said, trying to steady his voice, "I don't think this is just the flu." She didn't hesitate. "Get to the hospital, baby," she urged. "Don't wait." He'd heard that tone in her voice before. Steady, strong maternal instinct cloaked in calm urgency. A close friend drove him to Grady Memorial Hospital that evening. Elias remembered the hospital lights buzzing faintly overhead as a nurse helped him into a wheelchair. He was admitted for observation, and the doctors ordered tests just to rule things out. When the attending physician returned several hours later, Elias knew something was wrong. The woman didn't come in alone. 5 other doctors followed her into the room. She also carried something unexpected in her hand, a telephone. "You have a call," she said, her voice careful, confused. Elias took the receiver and heard his mother's voice. "I'll be there in the morning." She had already booked a red-eye flight. She didn't wait for details. She just knew. Then came the words that shattered the calm. "Elias," the doctor said, stepping closer, "you don't have the flu. You're in acute kidney failure. You also have pneumonia, pancreatitis, and fluids surrounding your lungs. There's a parasitic infection in your stomach." She paused, her eyes solemn. "And your labs indicate you're HIV positive with advanced stage AIDS. Based on what we're seeing, you may only have about 7 days to live." It didn't register at first. Elias stared at her, waiting for the punchline. This had to be a mistake, a joke, a mix-up in the chart. But the faces surrounding his hospital bed told him otherwise. This was real. A tide of disbelief washed over him, numbing his chest. He had walked in expecting antibiotics. Now he was being told to prepare his affairs. The room emptied, but the weight of those words remained. 7 days. That's all the time he supposedly had left. He sank deeper into the hospital bed, overwhelmed by silence. At 25, he had never imagined death as something personal. Abstract maybe, but not real, not imminent. And yet here it was, pressing against him like a cold wind through a cracked window. He felt betrayed by his body, betrayed by time. Just weeks ago, he was planning a new recording project, imagining what it might feel like to finally sing on stage. Now that dream felt like a balloon he could no longer reach, and then something unexpected began to happen. As he stared at the ceiling, tears stinging the corners of his eyes, his life began to play before him like a movie reel, unraveling in reverse. Moments from childhood, high school, early college years. Laughter, loneliness, missed chances, withheld feelings. He didn't know it yet, but he had just stepped into what many who experience near-death call the life review. It wasn't loud or dramatic. It was quiet, like a whisper from the soul. But that moment, the moment of diagnosis, was the rupture that changed everything. It marked the death of the life Elias had been surviving, and the beginning of the life he was finally meant to live. The sterile silence of the hospital room wrapped itself around Elias Monroe like a second skin. Machines hummed softly at his side, their digital rhythms a reminder that time hadn't stopped, though it certainly felt like it had. 7 days to live. The phrase echoed in his mind like a bell tolling in the distance. It didn't feel real. It didn't even feel possible. At just 25, Elias was standing at the threshold between this life and whatever might come next. For a while he lay still, staring at the ceiling tiles above him. They looked like a checkerboard of nothingness, white squares stretching into forever. And in that emptiness, something began to stir. It was as if a projector flicked on inside his soul. No lights, no screens, no dramatic music, just memory. But not the kind he could control. These weren't thoughts he chose. They chose him. The first image came suddenly. Elias, maybe 4 years old, standing in the living room of his grandmother's house in Savannah, holding a plastic microphone and belting out gospel hymns with such fierce joy his voice cracked. His mother clapped from the sofa, laughter ringing out like a hymn of its own. He could feel it, the unfiltered love of that moment, the way he belonged in his own body, the way his spirit soared when he sang. Then it shifted faster now. He saw himself at 10, sitting alone on a school bus, backpack clutched tightly against his chest. He was trying to disappear after being teased for his weight. That day, someone had called him soft. The word hit harder than any fist ever could. From then on, he learned to shrink, not just his body, but his spirit too. He saw moments he'd forgotten, and moments he had tried to forget. His first kiss, tender, secret, and rushed in the back stairwell of a dormitory. The night he turned down an invitation to sing at a campus showcase because he didn't feel ready. The years he spent working a job that looked good on paper but gnawed at his insides every day. Counseling others by day, burying his own dreams by night. This wasn't a highlight reel. It wasn't curated. It was raw, unfiltered, and deeply honest. As these images played, so did something else, questions. Not spoken aloud, yet deeply felt. They didn't come from the doctors or the machines. They came from within. And they came in waves. Have you truly been happy with the life you've lived? He tried to answer. At first he wanted to say yes. He had helped people. He had shown up for family. He had been a good man. But underneath that surface came another truth. He wasn't happy. Not deeply, not consistently, not in his bones. Have you ever really been yourself? That one cut deeper. He remembered all the times he'd held his tongue, all the parts of himself he had hidden to be acceptable. His voice, his queerness, his intuition, his softness. Even his boldest dreams had been watered down to fit a version of life that others approved of. Do the people in your life know how much you love them? He winced. The answer was no. He had loved them fiercely, his mother, his best friend Marcus, even his first real boyfriend Aaron. But he hadn't always told them. Vulnerability for Elias had always been risky. Too risky. So he held back the very words that might have healed him. I love you. I need you. You matter to me. Do you feel good about yourself? That question brought a lump to his throat. He realized then that most of his life had been shaped by shame. Shame about his body. Shame about his voice. Shame about wanting something different from what others expected. The only thing he had ever really felt confident in was his intellect, but that wasn't the same as self-worth. And deep down, he knew it. Have you fulfilled the purpose your soul came here to live? This one didn't need time to answer. The ache in his chest responded for him. No. He had sensed that he was meant to create beauty, to bring healing, to sing, to live openly, and inspire others to do the same. But fear had sat in the front seat for too long. And now, with just 7 days to live, he realized he had never truly let Elias be Elias. He lay there breathing slow and shallow, not from illness, but from revelation. It wasn't just the thought of death that terrified him. It was the thought of dying without ever having lived. And this was the part that older people, he imagined, must understand in their bones. Not the fear of the unknown, but the regret of what was known and never embraced. Regret doesn't haunt you with ghosts. It haunts you with possibilities that never came to pass. For Elias, those possibilities were clear. The album he never recorded, the conversations he never dared to have, the version of himself he had silenced. He wept, then not out of pity but out of awakening. Something was shifting. He could feel it. The room hadn't changed, but he had. This life review wasn't just a look back. It was an invitation forward, a holy mirror held up by something greater than himself. It was at that moment, in the stillness between despair and decision, that Elias whispered, "I want to live. Not just survive. Not just extend time." He wanted to live fully, out loud and without apology. He knew his body was weak. The prognosis was grim. But somewhere deep within, beyond diagnosis, beyond shame, beyond memory, he sensed that it wasn't over. Not yet. That there was still a choice to be made. A chance to reclaim his life, not from doctors or disease, but from fear. He didn't know how he would do it. He didn't have a plan. But he made a vow, if given the chance, he would no longer betray himself. No more shrinking. No more silence. No more waiting to be perfect to begin. He would start now. That moment, quiet as it was, marked the first miracle. Not of medicine, but of resolve. Elias Monroe had been handed a deadline. But instead of crumbling under it, he chose to wake up. And in that awakening, a new kind of life began. Not in the blood, not in the bones, but in the soul. The decision to live didn't arrive with fanfare. There were no flashing lights, no angelic voices, no sudden surge of energy rushing through Elias Monroe's frail body. It came as a whisper, quiet, steady, determined. "I'm not going to die in 7 days." That single sentence, barely audible to anyone but himself and the God he now dared to trust, marked the beginning of his fight. But this wouldn't be a fight like the ones he'd seen on television, the kind where people claw their way through surgery, chemotherapy, and endless tubes. Elias was already in a losing battle with his body. But something deeper inside him, something older than illness, had awakened. It wasn't a fight against death. It was a fight toward life. The doctors didn't believe it. And truthfully, he didn't blame them. His chart read like a litany of disaster: advanced stage AIDS, acute kidney failure, a compromised pancreas, pneumonia, a stomach parasite, and fluid around his lungs. He was pale, sunken, and so weak he could barely lift a spoon. Most patients in his condition didn't see a second week, let alone a second chance. But Elias didn't place his hope in medicine alone. He began placing it in something that most people had long forgotten: how to trust his own soul. The first thing he asked for was a journal. The nurse looked surprised, but brought him one. It was a simple spiral notebook with a blue plastic cover. That night, under dim hospital lights, Elias began to write down 3 things he was grateful for, no matter how small. Some days it was sunlight through the blinds, or my mother's voice on the phone. Other days, it was harder, breathing without pain. A nurse who smiled, but he kept going. He did this 3 times a day, even when he could barely hold the pen. Gratitude, he believed, would anchor him. Next, he asked the hospital social worker for something odd, a 3D model of a kidney. She blinked at first, unsure if he was joking, but returned the next morning with a plastic educational model. Elias placed it on his bedside table and began to visualize his kidneys healing. Every morning he imagined light flooding through them, clearing infection, restoring flow. He wasn't delusional. He knew the numbers on the chart. But something inside him whispered, "What you focus on grows." He also asked his parents, who had flown in and now stayed close, to serve as emotional gatekeepers. Any bad news from the doctors had to be filtered through them. Elias made a rule: no fear-based conversations near his bed. No talk of statistics, no grim timelines. He told his parents, "If the news is bad, tell me in a way that lets me keep hope." Each night before bed, he and his parents took turns sharing 3 things they loved about each other. The rule was that no one could repeat an answer from a previous night. At first it felt awkward, like a family therapy session wrapped in pajamas. But by the 3rd night, something changed. His mother's voice cracked when she told him, "I love how you still sing to yourself when you think no one hears." His father, normally quiet, almost stoic, told him, "I love that you challenge me to feel things I don't always know how to say." In those simple, sacred exchanges, healing had already begun. Elias also shifted how he spoke to his body. Instead of calling it sick or broken, he started saying, "My body is working hard to protect me. My body knows how to heal." He whispered affirmations each morning before the nurse changed his IV. "Thank you, kidneys. Thank you, lungs. Thank you, immune system. I see you trying." It wasn't magic, it was intention. He treated his body like an ally, not a battlefield. One of the most profound shifts, though, came internally. Elias began to forgive himself. He forgave himself for hiding, for staying silent, for choosing safety over truth. He forgave himself for betraying his own dreams and burying his voice. He had once believed forgiveness was something you gave to others. Now he realized the most powerful form was the one you gave to yourself. He also reconnected with prayer, not the desperate kind he had grown up with, where you plead for a miracle from a distant God, but the kind that sounded more like conversation. "Help me remember who I am. Help me love myself, even here, even now." The days passed slowly and quietly. Nurses began to take notice. Elias, once ghostly and motionless, now greeted them by name. He even cracked jokes. The IV drip still beeped. The dialysis still cycled through the nights. But something in the room had shifted. Hope lived there now. By the end of the 2nd week, well beyond his 7-day limit, his vitals began to improve. Lab work started showing signs of stabilization. His kidney function, once nearly gone, had ticked upward slightly. Doctors shook their heads. "We're not sure what's happening," one muttered. Elias smiled. "I am," he thought to himself. But it wasn't just the physical changes. Something deeper was emerging. He began to dream again, literally. In sleep, he saw visions of light moving through his chest, his back, his hands. In one dream, he stood barefoot on a stage under a single spotlight, not singing to be famous, but singing to free himself. That dream stayed with him. By the 4th week, the team cleared him for discharge. He left the hospital with a list of medications, a referral for follow-up care, and an official label miracle case. But Elias knew the truth. The real miracle wasn't that his body had begun to heal. The real miracle was that his soul had finally awakened. Back home, he continued the work. Gratitude journals, visualization, loving conversations, slowly shifting his diet to support his immune system. He saw a therapist. He joined a meditation group. He even stood in front of a microphone again this time. Not in front of an audience, but in his own living room, singing softly into the quiet. For the first time in years, he wasn't surviving. He was living. And more importantly, he was living as himself, not the version the world had shaped, but the version he was born to become. But life has a rhythm all its own. And just when it seemed he had turned a corner, life would soon bring him back to that fragile edge between earth and eternity. And this time he wouldn't just fight for life. He'd step beyond it and come back with a message that would change everything. For nearly a year, Elias Monroe lived like a man reborn. Each morning began with intention. He nourished his body with clean food, herbal teas, and daily stretches that reawakened muscles weakened by months in bed. More importantly, he nourished his soul. Writing music again, offering online support to young people living with chronic illness and saying "I love you" without flinching. People called it a comeback. Elias called it a return to himself. But healing, as he would learn, isn't always linear. Sometimes it winds like a country road, full of dips and turns, leading you places you didn't expect to revisit. It began subtly. A little more fatigue in the mornings, a familiar tightness in his chest after walking upstairs, a few nights of low-grade fever that he brushed off as stress or seasonal allergies. He didn't want to sound the alarm too early. He had come so far. But deep down, something didn't feel right. Then one morning he collapsed. It happened in the kitchen. He had just poured himself a glass of water when his knees buckled beneath him. The glass shattered across the tile floor. He had no strength to call for help. His vision blurred, and before he knew it, he was being lifted onto a stretcher as paramedics spoke in hurried tones above him. Back at Grady Memorial Hospital, the same halls, the same smells, Elias lay once again in a stark white bed under sterile light. It was all too familiar. Blood tests, monitors, oxygen tubes, cold stethoscopes, and concerned glances from nurses who tried to smile but couldn't quite hide the worry behind their eyes. When the new attending physician entered the room, Elias didn't need the clipboard to tell him the truth. He could see it in the man's face. "I'm not going to lie to you," the doctor said softly. "Your immune system has collapsed. All of your previous symptoms have returned: kidneys, lungs, infection. Your T-cell count is back to critical. We're prepping for an emergency procedure, but I want you to call your family." Elias blinked slowly. This time it wasn't 7 days. It was 48 hours. The news didn't strike like lightning. It settled on him like a weight he had already carried before. And yet, this time felt different. He didn't weep. He didn't panic. He didn't even pray, at least not in the way he once had. Instead, he stared at the ceiling and sank into a deep, still quiet. How could this be happening again? Hadn't he done everything right? He had changed. He had loved himself. He had awakened. But beneath those questions, another awareness emerged, quieter, but sharper than the rest. This isn't just illness. This is a message. He could feel it now, something deeper than his diagnosis, a knowing that this was not a random relapse. It was his soul trying to tell him something he hadn't yet understood, something vital, something unfinished. Lying alone in the dark, Elias asked a question, not out of fear, but out of readiness. What am I still not seeing? He closed his eyes and breathed in slowly. He wasn't just facing death. He was standing on the edge of something sacred, and it was about to reveal itself. Night settled quietly over the hospital, as if even time itself were holding its breath. Elias Monroe lay motionless in his bed, his body hooked to machines that beeped softly beside him. 48 hours, the doctor had said. Maybe less. His lungs wheezed under the pressure of fluid. His kidneys had failed again. And his T-cell count was so low, it barely registered. Yet Elias was not afraid, not like before. He had already made peace with the idea of death once. But now he sensed that this return to the edge wasn't about dying. It was about understanding. There was something he still needed to see, something unfinished. He could feel it pulsing beneath the hum of the oxygen tank. Not panic, not sadness, a summons. Lying still too weak to move, Elias whispered a question, not with his voice, but from somewhere deeper. What is it that I still need to know? No answer came immediately. Only silence. Thick. Sacred. But then slowly the room began to change. He didn't leave his body with a jolt. There was no tearing sensation, no drama. It was like falling inward rather than upward or outward. First, the hospital bed disappeared. Then the sound of the machines faded. His sense of where his body began and ended blurred until there was no edge, no border, no distinction between himself and the space around him. Everything became one. The bed, the walls, the air, the machines all melted together in a gentle dissolution of form. It wasn't frightening. It was freeing. Imagine being wrapped in a warm ocean where you are not floating on the water but have become the water. That's what it felt like. Elias could no longer tell where his fingertips ended or where the room began. He had dissolved into something vast and sacred. And then came the light. At first it was subtle, like the soft glow of sunrise against closed eyelids. But it intensified quickly, growing into the brightest light Elias had ever encountered. Still, it didn't blind him. It didn't hurt. It bathed him in a warmth so complete, it made every pain, every sorrow, every ounce of shame evaporate in an instant. But what came next surprised him. Alongside the light came the dark, not evil, not cold. It was more like depth, a velvet blackness that carried weight and presence. It was as if both polarities, light and dark, known and unknown, existed together in perfect balance. It didn't confuse him. It comforted him. Then from within that sacred space came a voice. It wasn't external. It wasn't something Elias heard with his ears. It was something he recognized deep in his being, as if it had always been there, just waiting to speak. And the voice sounded like him. But it was a version of himself, untouched by fear or shame. A voice soaked in wisdom and clarity. The voice of his essence, his source. What some might call God. There were no introductions, no formalities. Just truth, delivered in the quietest, yet most powerful way. The voice said, "The key you've been seeking to heal your body and to live a life that feels like heaven is the same. And it is this holy love yourself." The words sank into Elias like rain soaking into dry earth. Wholly love yourself. Not partially, not conditionally, not someday when you've improved enough. Now, as you are. In that moment, Elias knew. He hadn't really loved himself, not fully. Yes, he had done gratitude journaling, spoken affirmations, eaten healthy, prayed, and practiced healing. But deep down, he had still been trying to fix himself to become lovable. He was still trying to earn worth, and the voice was telling him the opposite. You are already worthy. From birth, from breath, from before time began. The voice continued gently. You have spent much of your life trying to make life be good to you, trying to earn goodness, approval, love. But you don't know yet how to let life be good to you. Life wants to love you. Let it. Elias wept not from sadness but from release. He had been swimming upstream most of his life, thinking effort, perfection, and performance would bring him peace. But here, in this infinite space of love and presence, he saw the truth. Healing was not something to force. It was something to allow. He saw as, in a vision, the years he had hidden his gifts, his music, his queerness, his intuition, thinking they were flaws instead of divine fingerprints. He saw how each moment of self-betrayal had dimmed his light. He wasn't being punished with illness. He was being called back to himself. Then came a download not in words but in knowing. He saw that his sickness wasn't an interruption. It was an invitation, a sacred teacher. Every collapsed organ, every fevered night, every frightening lab result had been trying to deliver this same message. Come home to who you really are. And he saw his soul as radiant, brilliant, luminous, and made of the same light he was now immersed in. But in his life, that light had been dimmed by shame, dulled by silence, and strangled by fear. Not because he was broken, but because he had believed a lie that he had to become something more to be enough. And now he saw the truth. You are enough. You are love itself. In that holy space there was no diagnosis, no pain, no history, no future, just presence. And in that presence Elias felt more alive than he had ever felt with a beating heart. It was joy beyond joy, peace beyond peace, completion, clarity, freedom. But then the voice returned with one final message. You must choose. You can stay, or you can return. But if you return, you must allow the old you to die. The one who lived in shame. The one who believed love had to be earned. That version of you cannot come back. But you can. And just like that, Elias knew. It wasn't enough to survive. He had to surrender. He had to let go of who he had been and become the version of himself that lived in alignment with his soul, that loved himself not because of what he did, but because of who he was. And he whispered back to the voice, yes. Yes to life. Yes to love. Yes to the journey of learning how to let life be good to him. Yes to shedding the layers of fear, guilt, and smallness that had choked his spirit for years. Yes to becoming whole again, not by addition, but by remembrance. And as he said yes, the light dimmed gently. The warmth remained, but the hospital began to return slowly, piece by piece. He felt the crispness of the sheets under his fingers. He heard the IV beeping again. He became aware of his breath, slow, steady, real. He was back, but he was not the same. Elias Monroe had died, and in his place a soul fully awake had returned. When Elias Monroe opened his eyes again, the hospital ceiling above him seemed almost unfamiliar, as if he were seeing it from another dimension. The pale fluorescent light hadn't changed. The steady hum of machines was still there. His mother's voice drifted in softly from the corner of the room, where she prayed under her breath. But something inside him had changed forever. He had returned from the edge of death, but not as the man he used to be. The version of Elias, who had lived under the weight of shame, who had tailored his life around other people's approval, who had measured his worth through perfection and productivity, that version had quietly passed away in that sacred encounter with Source. It was not a physical death. It was a soul death, a surrendering of the false self. And with that death came something more precious than breath freedom. But freedom, Elias discovered, wasn't a light switch. It was a journey. As his body stabilized day by day, his spirit entered unfamiliar territory. For the first time, he didn't just have to heal, he had to rebuild. Not his kidneys, not his immune system, but his identity. And rebuilding that would mean undoing decades of learned behavior and belief systems that had kept him trapped in survival mode. It wasn't easy. He realized that part of him had been addicted to suffering, not consciously but subtly. The drama, the struggle, the exhaustion of being the one who overcame had become a familiar story. But that story no longer fit. The real healing now required quiet, daily acts of self-love that were not dramatic, not glamorous, and not always comfortable. He began to speak to himself differently. When the inner critic tried to whisper, "You're falling behind," Elias answered, "I'm exactly where I need to be." When fear crept in, fear that the illness might return again, he didn't shove it away. He sat with it. listened to it, then gently reminded himself, I am safe now. I trust life. He deleted the playlists that made him feel numb and replaced them with music that made his soul swell. He turned down work that drained him. He stopped explaining his choices to people who didn't understand his journey. And for the first time in years, he stood in front of a mirror without flinching, not to inspect or correct, but to greet himself. He looked into his own eyes and said aloud, I love you. At first, it felt awkward, forced. But over time, it became a sacred ritual, a reintroduction. Each day, Elias was getting reacquainted with his own soul. He also returned to his intuitive gifts, those deep sensitivities he had once buried to stay acceptable. He had always been able to feel things in people's energy, to sense their pain behind their words. Now he began studying medical intuition, learning how emotions and unhealed trauma often show up in the body as illness. And not just for him, for others too. He began working quietly with people, friends at first, then friends of friends, offering insights, meditations, and energy. Healing rooted not in New Age hype, but in the ancient sacred knowing he had touched in that near-death space. He wasn't trying to become a guru. He was simply following the thread of his own light. And that light, he noticed, began to grow stronger the more he stayed aligned with truth. But truth, he learned, could be costly. Some people in his life didn't understand this new Elias. A few drifted away. Others questioned his choices. You've changed, they said, with tones that sounded more like warning than celebration. And they were right. He had. But he was no longer willing to apologize for it. He was no longer willing to dim down to make others comfortable. Because something sacred had taken root in him, something unshakable. He was no longer willing to trade authenticity for approval, no longer willing to chase busy over peace, no longer willing to postpone joy. In many ways, Elias had died in order to live. Not physically, but spiritually. He had released the self that had been shaped by fear, by shame, by the world's narrow expectations. And from the ashes of that old self, something luminous had emerged, not perfect, but true. His second near-death wasn't the end of his story. It was the beginning of a life fully alive. Elias Monroe didn't wake up one day to a trumpet blast or sudden clarity about his future. His new life didn't arrive with grand announcements or spiritual fireworks. It came in small, sacred steps, each one marked by the quiet courage to live in truth. After being discharged from the hospital for the second time, Elias returned home to an apartment that no longer felt like just a place to live. It felt like a sanctuary. The same walls that had once echoed with silent shame now held space for daily rituals of peace. Every morning he brewed a cup of herbal tea, opened the blinds to let sunlight pour in, and sat still for a few minutes with his hand over his heart, not to do something, but to simply be with himself. He started writing again, not just journal entries, but songs. Lyrics flowed from him like spring water filled with raw emotion, hope, and a kind of hard-earned beauty that can only come from walking through fire. He didn't care about record labels anymore. He didn't chase gigs or beg for validation. He just sang because it healed him, and he shared it because he wanted to offer healing to others. People began to notice. Messages trickled in. Your words feel like medicine. I don't know why, but your voice made me cry in a good way. Soon, without any fanfare, Elias began offering workshops on self-love, intuitive healing, and spiritual resilience. He didn't teach from textbooks, he taught from experience. From the hospital bed, from the life review, from the moment he chose to stay. He also reached back toward the younger generation he had once counseled. He hosted monthly circles for teens and young adults living with HIV and chronic illness, not to fix them, but to reflect back their wholeness. He told them, "You are not broken. Your illness doesn't define you, but how you love yourself in the midst of it, that's where your power is. The more Elias lived aligned with his soul, the more life seemed to meet him with grace. Opportunities flowed to him without striving. Collaborations came from unexpected places. New friendships formed deeper, richer, rooted in shared authenticity instead of pretense. He no longer settled for connections that required him to shrink, and remarkably, his body continued to improve. His immune system strengthened. His lab results stabilized. Doctors called it a sustained recovery, but Elias knew the truth: his body was following his soul. Still, he kept things simple. He grew herbs on his balcony. He visited his mother every Sunday, where they sat on the porch and talked about life and God and sometimes nothing at all. He laughed more. He rested without guilt. He lived like a man who had learned what mattered and was no longer willing to trade it for anything less. His new life wasn't perfect, but it was his. And for the first time, it felt real. Today, when Elias Monroe speaks, he doesn't tell people how to avoid pain. He doesn't promise miracles or quick fixes. What he offers is far more honest and far more powerful. He speaks about coming home to yourself, even in the middle of the storm, about how healing isn't just about medicine or clean lab results. It's about remembering who you are underneath the fear, the shame, and the noise of the world. He tells people you don't have to wait for a hospital bed to change. You don't have to nearly die to begin truly living. His message is simple, but it lands like truth, carved in stone. Wholly loving yourself isn't just self-care, it's soul care. It's what allows the body to heal the heart, to soften, and life to finally feel like a gift instead of a burden. To older adults, especially those who've lived through hardship, loss, or silent suffering, Elias's story doesn't feel like fantasy. It feels like a return, a sacred reminder that it's never too late to love the parts of yourself you were once taught to hide. Never too late to let life be good to you. Never too late to start again. Elias once thought he had 7 days to live. Now he lives each day as if it's exactly the right time to love, to create, to breathe, and to be free. And for those who listen, really listen, his life isn't just a testimony. It's an invitation. Elias Monroe didn't return from death with all the answers, but he came back with something far more enduring: clarity. That the purpose of life was never perfection. It was presence, not achievement, but alignment. Not proving, but becoming. And perhaps that's the greatest gift of his story. The quiet reminder that wholeness isn't something you earn. It's something you remember. In the end, Elias didn't just survive. He awakened. And in doing so, he became a living testimony to what's possible when we dare to love ourselves all the way home. Call for support. This story is more than just words. It's a reflection of lives transformed, of souls awakened, and of second chances that matter. When you like, share, or subscribe, you're not just supporting a channel. You're helping these stories reach the hearts that need them most. Tap subscribe to walk with us on this journey of healing, faith, and purpose. Leave a comment. Your voice may be the encouragement someone else is waiting for. Every click makes a difference. Every view carries hope forward. Thank you for being here. Let's keep the light going.